left unsaid. Days that can't be counted by the time till rent. Tomorrow's just another like the one that comes next. The corner of the highway that leads to the job, at the desk by the boss with the elegant watch. The tick of the clock and the tick of the clock mark the moments till the ticking stops.
David Epstein, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
I get asked to speak at innovation and creativity conferences a lot, and one of the things that always comes up is this demystification of the creative work that we do at the Second City, because people assume that our improvisational process is some kind of magic born of unfettered freedom, and I actually have to offer the opposite, that its genius is in a kind of meticulous design. There's structure, rules, and an ecosystem that allow us to seemingly make something out of nothing, which is exactly what you discovered across actually a really wide variety of domains in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I'd love to hear more about some of those rules, but I think this is, I talked to the music producer, Rick Rubin, about this a little bit too. And he said, people think, just what you said, that from the outside, people think that when they see these creative outputs, that this must be just the product of this total freedom, right? Like if only I were unbound from the stuff that I do every day, creativity could flourish. And it turns out to be totally the opposite, that whether it's ritual and structure that actually builds the sandbox that you're then free to play in, or even putting down rules that actually purposely restrict your choices. Because as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham likes to say, I love how he put it, that you may think your brain is made for thinking, but it's actually made for preventing you from having to think whenever possible, because thinking is energetically costly and your brain is wired for convenience, not for working hard. And so when you're just given a whole field of open possibilities, you'll go for the easy thing to do, the first thing that pops to mind, the very familiar thing. If you want to be creative, you actually, one of the best creative prompts is blocking whatever the first thing that comes to mind that you would do naturally. And then you're forced off that path of least resistance. So whether it's kind of the macro of building this discipline and structure that people then feel free to experiment inside of, or the micro of like really blocking people's first instincts, creativity flourishes under constraints.
Yeah, so at Second City, God, there's so much. Well, first of all, just the design of space and time. So you have this theater space. We're there creating the process of a new show over like a 12-week period. What we know is there's so many hours in the day that you can actually be doing this work and be successful at it. And it's not a lot. Like it's like 3, 4, 5 hours. That a class is never more than 3 hours. The show itself is a 2 acts of scripted content with a third act that's improvised. That improvised thing is late at night. It's free. The cast often changes clothes to dress down, all signaling certain kinds of things.
Yeah. I've been a number of times.
Yeah,
I remember and loved it. Yeah.
so all that stuff is very purposefully designed to get the thing, the end product, and then the improv rules themselves, which are, I know there's a lot of railing against the rules, and that's awesome. There should be,
of course.
But the rules are there to be railed against. But you need a box in which to play, and so the idea. I mean, we'll start with Yes and, because that's my book and the focus of the podcast. But Yes and is about the thing you referenced, which is I need to accept the reality of what the other person said and build on it. And when I do that, and then they do that back to me, we are co-creating in a way that we are not pre-writing, and it's very much Kahneman's system 1, system 2 back and forth, because you're having to sort of call this sort of response, but you got to be quick because the audience is going to be responding to that. So Yes and is a kind of liberation from your own bias, which is why we've done so much work with behavioral scientists, because they're like, wait a sec, this illustrates the science.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you brought up another thing that I think constraints are really useful for, which is facilitating collaboration. Because, there are things like when I was reading, for instance, this big body of research on brainstorming, and it turns out it's actually a terrible way to, just like free brainstorming is a terrible way to generate novel ideas. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. One of which is unclear norms, where people are told like, uh, say whatever comes to mind, but don't criticize. You're like, well, those things are really mutually exclusive, right? So there are all sorts of unclear norms. And when you set something like yes, and these behavioral rules, when people are clear on the norms, it may, exclude certain possibilities, but it just allows collaborate. I mean, and this works at the scale of societies too, right? Like I write about some of this in the book, Douglas North, this Nobel laureate economist's work, is that when shared prosperity started to spread around the world was in large part based on norms that allowed strangers to be more understandable to one another so that their behavior was more predictable. And so these kinds of rules, it's like, okay, this person I'm collaborating with, I understand something here. And that's what allows the collaboration in the first place.
I got into a big argument with Nick Epley at University of Chicago about this when we were working together, because I understand some of the research on brainstorming. I'm like, well, of course, that like free form brainstorming doesn't work, just like free form anything doesn't work.
But that's surprising to most people. Like, it is, that from a lot of experience.
I do.
But there was an international survey of psychologists on known creativity myths around the world. And number one was that group brainstorming is a great way to come up with creative ideas. And the number one most popular. And number two most popular was that people are most creative when they are most free. So this stuff is second city nature to you. But for most people, this is novel stuff.
Yeah, I love when I'm doing an interview, because this comes up all the time, of like the perfect number that they talk about with regard to this. And I go, do you want to guess what the number of cast members are at Second City? And they're like, is it 6? And I'm like, yes, it's 6. And it's like, and it's amazing, because it's 6 people, and there's an outside director, and you're right, there's all these rules. Okay.
I interrupted you about Nick Epley, though, and I want to hear the end of that story when you were arguing about brainstorming.
No, I mean, the thing here's where we got to, which I said the problem is, if you want to effectively understand great brainstorming, you would study the 6 actors on the main stage of Second City over a year. But no one is going to do that, because that number is not enough. They right. need bigger numbers. They're not. It's so time intensive. But I'm like, but of course that's good brainstorming. Yeah, like it's never going to be 250,000 people, who don't know each other. It is going to be a mixture, and the science also talks about this. It's going to be a mixture of people who do know each other, but then other people who are new. And yep, exactly. And then some of the other constraints that we talked about, all of which, and again, this stuff started at Second City. Well, Second City opened in 1959, but it's all based on Viola Spolin's work from the 1920s and 30s, a social worker at Jane Addams Hull House who was working with immigrant children to have them collaborate and communicate. And so she created all the improv games that you might know from a Piven Workshop, because you grew up in Evanston, but we're done here. And so it's like, oh, this was understood as social work, and Viola's son, Paul Sills, becomes the artistic director of Second City and turns it into theater. So it's like, it's not such a crazy idea that what we're doing would fit if you know about the history. Yeah.
I mean, you're just like, you're deep in the science here. I mean, that issue of getting a group where you have some people that have old relationships and then you introduce an injection of novelty. I mean, that pattern shows up in like the highest impact science, like the history of Broadway plays and all this stuff. Like you're deep following the behavioral science here.
Yeah. Well, it's like the gift of a 10-year career of doing this after doing the other is great. So I'm going to start, I know we're already talking, but I thought about this a lot because I really love this book. And I think the latest data I've seen is that only about 2% of readers of nonfiction read all the way to the end of a book.
Wow.
And in defense of the 98%, I'm actually going to defend them. It's my overwhelming experience that a lot of nonfiction books do run out of steam. But that's not the case with your book. And I actually want to start our conversation with your last chapter. But to do that, I need you to introduce our audience to a company called General Magic.
Okay. I would love to do that.
Okay.
So General Magic, and this is a story about the danger of too few constraints. General Magic was the company that had everything. So it was founded around 1990, and it was so visionary that Goldman Sachs took them public in the first so-called concept IPO in history, which meant they went public with an idea, not yet with a product. And it was founded by 3 former Apple employees, 2 of whom had been designers of the original Mac. The third, a guy named Mark Peratt, who would become the CEO. His job at Apple had been seeing the future of technology after personal computing, what's coming next. And he was an absolute visionary. In reporting, I read his PhD dissertation, 1976 at Stanford, and he coins the term information economy on the first page. And he just sees the next 40 years of technology, what's coming. And so in 1989, he sketches in this big red leather notebook a thin glass rectangle with no protruding buttons and a touchscreen and rectangular apps. Like you would, if I showed it to you right now, you'd think it was the iPhone. The web did not exist yet. 15% of American households had computers. And so this vision that, I mean, is so compelling. It just draws huge amounts of talent, huge resources onto the team. They build this 17-member alliance of the biggest information technology companies in the world, so much that their meetings have to start with an antitrust lawyer listing all the things they're not allowed to talk about. And just money pours in and talent pours in. They're making this iPhone. They're basically making this personal communicator, 20 years early. And they can do anything because they have unlimited funds. They have unlimited talent. I mean, it's an absolute all-star team. And because they can do anything, they frequently do anything. Any cool idea that someone has, they start doing it. And they define their customer as Joe Sixpack, and they didn't take any more time to define who that person was. So they really didn't know who they were building for or whose problem they were solving. There's this saying in design that people don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole in the wall. Like you're supposed to focus on the problem that you're solving, not on the cool thing you can make. And theirs was cool things. I mean, and some of it was amazing. Early form of USB, precursors to emojis. They had a virtual meeting space for devices where they could autonomously interact for commerce. And they called it the cloud, again, in 1990. But they never defined what they were doing. So the project just grew and grew, and they added more people and more features and all these things. I think the emblematic interview was with this engineer named Steve Perlman, who was charged with creating a calendar function. And he wrote it to go from 1904 to 2096 and checks it in and thinks he's done. Then a team leader comes to him and says, Steve, someone might write historical apps. You got to make this thing go back farther. So he writes it to go from year 0 to the future and checks it in and thinks he's done. Then another team comes and says, Steve, why are you tying it into this arbitrary religious context? You should go back to the beginning of astronomical time. So he writes the calendar function to go from the Big Bang to the future. And it takes months when it could have just been 4 lines of code and they could have moved on. But because they had the time, they had the resources, they had the talent, everything grew. And when the device finally shipped years late, it had a 200-page user manual because it was so complicated. The experience was choppy because they loaded it with so much. It was really expensive. And no one was clear what problem it solved for them. And so it was just an utter flop, even though it had some really cool technology. Whereas people inside of General Magic who bit off much smaller pieces, like defined a customer problem. One guy split off and said, I'm going to make something for busy professionals that want to sync their contacts and calendars on the go. And it's going to have a calendar, contacts, and memo pad, period. That was the Palm Pilot.
Yeah.
Right? Smash. 3 functions of General Magic's $1 million. A low-level service engineer said, I think there's an easier way to facilitate commerce between strangers, and made a website called Auction Web that was facilitating auctions. And General Magic had a right to IP developed by any employee. So he brought it to the general counsel. Said, look at this. No. Too small. We have a much bigger vision. So he took it out, and that was eBay. So all these people that bit off a smaller chunk and defined a customer problem turned into huge successes. The company was a disaster, although the people inside of it, especially the younger people that learned these lessons about constraints, ended up creating technology that every person listening to this will touch on a daily basis. But the company itself, I think, was emblematic of this idea, where Peratt said his goal in raising so much money so early was to create heaven for engineers, where they were limited only by their imagination. What more could someone ask for, he said. And I think the answer was less freedom.
If you had written this as an article for The Atlantic, I could see it being titled The Downside of Abundance.
Absolutely. Right?
That's
a great title. Yeah.
So what's interesting about this chapter 2 is you do a bit of a weave, and I'm sorry for using that term. I don't mean to tie you into a Trump weave, but what you are doing is like, and it's a thing I think I play with a bit too, because I touch so many different authors and ideas, and so many of them come up in your book. Leidy Klotz is on the podcast, and all these different people. And a person you sort of land on early in that chapter is Herbert Simon. And you say, quote, "If I had to choose a single thinker whose work most influenced this book, it would be Herbert Simon." Tell us about when Simon got confronted with this playground in Milwaukee.
Yeah, that was sort of the beginning part of his career when he was just an undergraduate studying political science. And he decided to do a project to go study the budgeting process of playgrounds in Milwaukee. And what he basically saw was, well, what he had learned in Econ 101 was that the way budgets should be done is you allocate the next dollar in the place where it has the highest marginal benefit.
Sure.
And what he saw was a dispute between basically the education department and the parks department, essentially. And they had built these new playgrounds, and they had the same goal. They wanted people to use them more. And the education department wanted to invest in more staff, like to lead activities in order to do that. And the parks department, which had just built all this beautiful new stuff, wanted to invest in maintaining it and equipment and landscaping and all these kinds of things. And what Simon saw was that not once did this issue of where the next marginal dollar should go ever come up. Mm-hmm. Everyone saw it through their own lens of the things they worked on. And in the end, the education department had a little more power. And so it went to staff. And it was just this first inkling he had that, everything I've learned in neoclassical economics about how people make decisions is not actually true on the ground, where they consider all these options, they pick the next, place. Like, it's so far from the truth. I understand that it's a model, right? But it's so far from the truth that it doesn't even touch on reality, basically. Mm-mm. And so that led to him starting this career of, in sort of behavioral economics eventually, where he really overturned a lot of the so-called rational actor model of humans, in which, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish.
I was just going to say, in the rational actor model, more choice is always better, right? There's no reason you should have yes and or any rules or any structures, because in the rational actor model, which is still in all sorts of research and all sorts of papers, more choice is always better because you'll evaluate them all and pick the best one. It's just that is absolutely not how our brains actually work.
This reminds me of when we were just starting this collaboration up at University of Chicago. Richard Thaler asked my wife, Ann, who's also a longtime Second City person, to co-lead an exec ed program. And there was a dinner afterwards. And she had done the yes and exercise. And he's like, wait, there's science about this. People's default position is to say no or do nothing. It's not about rational. And you're kind of meaning that. And then at dinner, he made her do a bunch of more exercises so he could see how this stuff is working. And so this idea that we're not operating rationally, so let's have some rules for the road about that we can get to a better decision is baked into what we do here.
Yeah.
But what I don't know if it is or isn't is then when Simon finds this sort of dichotomy between maximizing and satisficing.
Yeah. So he coined that term satisficing, which is a portmanteau of satisfy and suffice. Mm-hmm. And what it means is, because our brains are not really capable of evaluating all the options, we're definitely not capable of understanding the repercussions of all of our decisions prospectively, is that really the way we operate is by sort of having good enough rules and using mental shortcuts and all these kinds of things. And what he argued was that we should actually do this more proactively. And because on the other end of the spectrum from satisficing, so these are researchers that we're building on is what's called maximizing, like really trying to evaluate all your options, putting a lot of energy into search. And researchers like Barry Schwartz and others who created a maximization scale that determine how much of a maximizer versus satisficer someone is. What they basically found, if I can simplify a big body of work in a nutshell, is that it's almost always bad to be a maximizer. So yeah. Not in every single case, but maximizers tend to be less happy with their decisions. They are more prone to regret. They're less happy with their lives. they're much more likely to prefer reversible decisions, even though the reality is that tends to just prevent them from committing one way or another. Whereas satisficers have more of a tendency to ahead of time say, here are the needs I need to fulfill, and when I reach that, I'm making the decision and I'm moving on. And so they can make a lot more decisions. And it's not that they necessarily have low standards. It's just that their standard is something other than best imaginable. And so they don't spend as much, as Simon said, if you counted the cost of search, which is both the time and energy of doing it and then the bad feeling about it once you've done it, then you would see that satisficing actually is the maximizing strategy. Sadly, there's signs that maximizing behavior is on the rise throughout the world.
Totally. Yep.
Nobody knows why for sure. I mean, I think the simple guess is that, there's an endless ability to compare yourself, your vacation, the product you're purchasing to this infinite number of other possibilities. So when I go on Amazon now, say, all right, here's the 2 things I need this broom to do for me. And once I see those 2 things, I'm not looking for the one that also has a laser pointer. I'm like, I'm done.
That's right.
And I definitely have tendencies to search all the products.
Oh, we all do. So there's 2 ideas that struck me that are Second City related. One is a term my wife and I use that various owners and or leaders of Second City hate, but is absolutely true and endemic to what we do, which is the good enough show. That there are times where, hey, there's 3 understudies in the show, and it is going to be, if you came and you're like, hey, this isn't the same as what I saw with the original cast, like, no, but it's good enough, and the audience is having a good time. And sometimes you got to be okay. There is no perfection, and you don't know, that group that's on stage could be giving someone a transformative experience in the audience, and you are just from your perspective, and you know what the other show looked like. They hate that. And then the other term that we use a lot is bring a brick, not a cathedral. So many people walk into these rooms and it's like, I've got this thing. And we're like, yeah, you know what? We co-create here. And what we discover is that there's benefits to other ideas in terms of growing this. So let's build it brick by brick.
Interesting.
To get to our cathedral. And I think that is an anti-maximizing strategy, or maybe okay, good. Yeah, because I was going to say, or it's a strategy to do the best satisficing that you can possibly do. I just think that there's an equation, unfortunately, in contemporary culture, like if you're not scaling, you don't matter.
Yeah.
And it's like, but to what point? You know?
No, I think that's really, really well said. I love that idea. Like for the good enough show, first of all, one thing you mentioned in there was kind of the glanced off of the comparison is the thief of joy, right? So I always have to think about this. I mean, I even started for myself. Once I started writing books, the book it feels cathedral-like in my world. And having done that once successfully, I then felt a little paralyzed from doing anything else because I felt, well, it has to be another cathedral to use that language. And I kind of got paralyzed and was not producing much for a while. And that's when I started a newsletter, like a Substack, purposely as having read Simon and a bunch of his other work, as a satisficing exercise. And the way I started the newsletter, this isn't going to make anybody want to read it, but was if a book has to be, for my effort level, like a 9 or a 10, if I get a Substack post to 6.5, I send it. Every time I send it, I'm like, oh, there's these few more things I think I should add and do more research. But if I get it to 6.5, I send it, and people like it, and I like it, and I love that it occupies that place in my life. And I think it's leaked into other areas where I'm like, sometimes a 6.5 is okay, and a bunch of people like it, And so I purposely have satisficing exercises in my life. And to your point, one of my favorite, when I was at Sports Illustrated, an older writer who gave me some advice, I remember I was beside myself because something I loved got cut from a story at some point because the story just lost pages. And I just could not get over this. And he said, the readers don't know what's not there.
Yeah.
And that had such an impact on me. I mean, with this book, this was my shortest book. And I took my 100,000 word, what I call master thought list of notes and all that stuff. And I forced myself to make a 1-page outline from those 100,000 words. This is it. You can see I like tried to write as small as possible to like defeat my own system with like bubbles and arrows going everywhere. And it forced me to clarify these priorities instead of trying to shoehorn in everything that I think is interesting. And that was a little painful. And it meant that I left a lot of stuff I find interesting on the table, but the readers don't know what's not there. And so I always remind myself of that. And I think it's incredibly useful. And that sounds like similar to the show. It's like the people involved, you know, the people watching don't know what's not there.
No. And there's another thing. There's a line. I had a playwriting teacher at Lake Forest College who told me, if you can't tell me what your play is in one sentence, you don't have a play.
Oh, wow.
Which I love because it really requires you to, what's the essence of this thing? And and the similarity I was finding, especially in this last chapter, in your career as I know it that you talk about, in your life and mine. So I was a soccer star. And like in grade school, I practiced with the high school team. My junior year, we went to the state finals. I had injuries, but it wasn't so much an injury that I never touched a soccer ball again. But I had a mental thing of like, this is not making me happy. Like I'm at the top here, center forward, state final. And you know, no, I never played again. And it opened me up to a world of ideas and thoughts that led me to Second City, where I started producing in 1992. And I did that through 2015. And then I had another sort of epiphany because I wrote the book Yes and, which also was a big hit, and I have not written another one yet. Thinking about still, but my shift at that point was then, okay, so I have all this knowledge about Second City. I've now just written this book, and I didn't consider myself a business guy. I guess I always have been, but it was a business book, and it did really well. And then I started the podcast, and then I'm entertaining all these different ideas, and they're connecting with like, oh, I remember when I was into the existentialists and Kierkegaard and other people, like this seems to be connecting with it. Now knowing Kahneman, and my friend Linnea was the chief of staff for Kahneman's last book. So I gave notes on the book.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it was like, because, you know, again, to his work, he wants non-experts and sees value in that. And literally there was a chapter I didn't understand. And I said, I guess this chapter 7, I don't understand. And that chapter got cut.
Oh, that's amazing. He was
cool.
Like one of my intellectual heroes. I spent some time with him for my previous book.
Exactly. Same. I mean, this is like, the Kahneman autographed Thinking Fast and Slow is in an honored space next to the original Howl, Allen Ginsberg Howl. But you then synthesize some of the stuff and going back to your experiences as an athlete and as a thinker. And I thought it was really powerful when you wrote about Ben Helfgott, and you tell the story of who he is, your relationship, and what you did and didn't do, and how that led into what I would say is maybe a more transformative POV about how one might want to live their life based on these ideas.
Yeah, that is so interesting. You know, I've done a bunch of podcasts, and nobody has ever asked me about Ben.
That's because I didn't read to the end of the book.
That could be. That's so interesting. So Ben Helfgott was a guy I wrote about. This is funny serendipity. There was an editor at Sports Illustrated who would go to London, like not sleep for 2 days and just see plays, and he would bring back little like things he had torn out of newspapers and put them in people's mailboxes if he thought they'd find it interesting. Funny. And he tore something out. I don't even remember what it was, but there was a side thing, like a tiny note that mentioned an award given to a guy who was the only living Olympian to have survived a concentration camp. And I was like, whoa, okay, I need to learn more about that. And I ended up writing about him. So Ben, he grew up in Poland. He was orphaned in the Holocaust. All of his cousins dead, parents dead. His sister survives, just him and his sister. And he was part of this group called the Boys. So the UK was going to accept 1,000 children who were orphaned, and they could only find like 770 or something. So they were brought to the UK. It was called the Boys because girls were usually killed first. So it was like 720 of them were boys, and they kind of became each other's family. And so I got to know him, and he became not just a subject of this writing, but a friend, a mentor. He was an amazing guy. He was kind of the head of the boys, and part of his real life's work was keeping them cohesive. A lot of them turned into wonderful adults, even though these terrible things happened to them, and trying to get them to go back to the places of their childhood, to go back to Poland primarily, also Germany, things like that, because he said we have to rebuild these bridges. Like we have to rebuild these bridges. Like the people there now aren't necessarily at fault, but it doesn't matter. Like we have to try to rebuild these bridges. So it was like his life was so animated by forgiveness. And he actually asked me to write a book. He liked the article very much and asked me to write a book about his life. And I started doing that. I went and stayed at his house and would meet up with him a lot. And it was just fascinating and I loved it. But for various reasons, I was starting to think I just wasn't up for that book at that point. Like I was early in my career. I had a ton of other responsibilities. I loved talking to him and spending time with him, but I just didn't think I had it in me. And at one point I think he sensed my reticence at a certain point, and he just called me and said, I just want you to know that whatever happens with this book thing, do it or don't do it, we will always be great friends. And it's like he sensed this thing in me and gave me what I called pre-forgiveness before I had ever asked for it. And it turned out that I told him, I'm like, yeah, I don't think I can do this right now. Like I have too many other things I have to do. And he was like, fine. And then we talked about other stuff. And when he passed away around that time, a few years ago, I was reading this philosophical work about what a few contemporary philosophers called narrative values that are like themes in the story of your life. And if you go back and look through your life, like what if you were a character, what are some of the themes? And for me, I think it would be things like curiosity, open-mindedness, diligence, stuff like that. And these are values that are held across culture. So you identify those themes in your life. And it's a way of like, in this world of infinite number of things to care about, like every time you open a browser tab, you can find 100 things that are really important to care about. But if you can have these sort of limited number of North Stars that you identify, I think it can help you consolidate your caring in a way that is really, we know it's important to have a coherent life story. And they can really make the world feel more manageable and let you know when you want to stand on your values. And so I picked a few that identified a few in my past story. And then I wanted to add one that I did not have in my past story, which was inspired by Ben, which was forgiveness. Because I've had a tendency to hold grudges about things. And here's this guy who lost everything and making these trips back. And it just made me seem so petty in my grudge. It's like he's forgiving people this and I can't. So I had these ones that I identified, but Ben led me to want to add this other theme to my life. And just the act of saying like, this is that theme that I want to add to my story, it made me cognizant of any time an opportunity comes up where I would default to my normal mode of operation and say, no, this is a thing that I've decided I'm working on in my story. And for me, that's been really powerful.
There's so much that story spoke to me. One is post-traumatic growth. This idea that you take a tragedy and you find some, and we've had tragedy in our lives and have experienced that directly. The other is validation, that really at the end of the day, most people just want to be validated. And if you can just end it at that, like, hey, I see this sucks. And you don't necessarily need more than that. And the other thing that is still fuzzy, but I want to bring it up, which is, I talk a lot about these unscripted moments, right? Because improvisation is an expertise of mine. One of the things that is unusual about Second City compared to almost any other theater is mostly in the world, you have either improv theaters or you have someone to do sketch comedy. Very few like dive into improvisation as a way to get to these scripted shows that are pretty much fully scripted in most cases. And I remember I was interviewing Vanessa Bonds for the podcast, and she brought up a study that they had done, I think it was at Cornell. And they had brought people in, and they said, all right, hand over your phone, unlock your phone, hand it over to me and unlock it. I'm gonna do some stuff. You're gonna leave the room, and I'm gonna do some stuff, and we'll give it back to you afterwards. And in most cases, people like gave the phone. And then the other group, they said, all right, so come in, unlock your phone, give it to me. If you don't want me, to access your phone, just say, Kelly, you don't have to access my phone. And in that, more people did say no. Not all, but a sizable chunk said no. And what that struck in me, being someone who thinks a lot about unscripted and scripted, is that unscripted is incredible for these sort of yes and creativity, early stage, like wide funnel.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, giving someone a script is when you need to narrow to get to the thing. How do I get to that? I take all this stuff, and how do I get to a thing that can be useful in the world, that I can give for someone, that can be tangible and consistent over time? And there hasn't been much, if anything, written about that transition. And I think there's a germ of something in there.
I agree. You mentioned that you were thinking about another book. I'm curious if that's
maybe
the
that
germ
comes up.
that might
Maybe.
be, because I think that's really interesting, right? It's almost like a bit of a phase transition, of water turning into ice or something. It's like,
Right.
I mean, that kind of structured process, I think it'd be enormously valuable. Right. First of all, the kind of structured brainstorming that that you've talked about with yes and, which again, adding structure to brainstorming makes it legitimately useful.
Yes.
And then really refining, and carving off all the little pieces until you get the sculpture. That sounds like an amazing idea. I'd love to read you writing about that process.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you this: the sort of one of the more dominant schools of improvisation right now is represented by the UCB, which stands for Upright Citizens Brigade, and their philosophy is a thing called game of the scene. But basically, it's like find the game and heighten. And Saturday Night Live very much is representative in the last few years of that. It can be very, very funny. The thing it doesn't do is give you sort of the lasting characters that you got when they were hiring people from Second City and the Groundlings, who were all about a character who can transform. So, the Kate McKinnons and the Kristen Wiggs and the A.D. Bryants and all those people who came out of sort of Spolin-based improvisation, which is, again, this sort of social work that was looking for how individuals can have transformative lives together. So, yeah, there's probably something there, and thank you for helping me tease it out.
Wait, that's so interesting. So, okay, so identifying the game, sort of meaning like, what is the core premise that makes this thing funny, and you just like keep heightening it, whether it's like the interaction between like a game show host and this like very strange guest or something, and heighten. But it's kind of like more one-off instead of like being based on a character who's going to like evolve over the sketch itself.
Yeah. And again, it's in our work, if you're not improvising towards transformation, that's what we use, which is like you're changed in some way, or you're not changed in another way, or the other character is that is the theater roots of Second City. Like all the folks who started this were, it was University of Chicago in 1950s. So who's teaching there? Martin Buber, Reinhold Niebuhr, Milton Friedman. I mean, it's wild in terms of the influence that those folks.
Yeah.
And then I remember, you're going to dig this. My wife had told me, this is when the Lie to Me was on TV. For people, this is a TV show, and it was about Paul Ekman, who was very famous for his studies that he called micro expressions or something like that. Like he could tell. He theorized that he could tell people that they lied or not. And Anne had found out that Ekman was at University of Chicago at the exact same time that all the Second City founders were there. So he was still alive. I got his secretary. I set up a phone call with him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I ran lights for them." And he got fired because he fell asleep during the show. And Ekman's work has been kind of debunked, which is interesting with regard to that. But my theory, and he basically agreed, was there was something in the water at the time with regard, because University of Chicago had no theater department. So these guys were all doing this separate from their studies. But there was something about the sort of intellectual water that was happening there, and how that might have been expressing itself that led to all this work across different mediums that we're still reckoning with today. Because by the way, I always joke that Milton Friedman is the enemy of this podcast. That will come up like every year at some point.
That's really funny. And since I'm obviously going to go try to look up clips now after this as soon as we're done talking. So can you recommend for me a great like Saturday Night Live clip I should watch to see the character evolution? Does anything come to mind? If not, I'll just search around the actors that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I think when you look at like Will Ferrell's characters, all of them have sort of transformative qualities. Again, Kate McKinnon. If you look at the early guys, right? John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, they're all Second City. Gilda Radner, best example, Second City. There's pathos. There's other stuff sort of underneath it. And then if you look at, just do the current cast, who are very talented, you're not going to see, you would never place them in a theatrical context.
Got it. Okay.
You would place them in a TikTok.
All right. I now have a lot of videos to watch today.
I'm sorry about that. You do actually note in the book, you cite Keith Sawyer's work, and I know Keith really well. You say, quote, as creativity researcher, Keith Sawyer has written specifically limits options, but enhances creativity, which is why beginning improv actors are taught to be specific. And then you talk about Keegan-Michael Key's substitute teacher scene. So that was written by Rich Tellerico, who's a Second City alum. And I want, and Keegan, of course, is someone I hired at Second City, and he did variations, not that exact scene or that exact character, but variations on it when he was performing here. And I love when Keegan's so thoughtful about improvisation and sports. Again, something that you and I share, and he shared. That's an interesting thing, that improv actors are all like huge sports heads. Because I think they're not people who came out of like traditional theater programs, at least the current group, or the last 15 years. But talk a bit why you included that substitute teacher in terms of this idea of playing inside a constraint.
Well, I love Key and Peele, and I loved that sketch, and I thought the way that he described it in this interview was so interesting. Where he, to your point, made this analogy to basketball. Like he was in the interview talking about Dr. James Naismith, who had been essentially invented basketball by putting a peach basket on the wall and asking young guys to throw a ball into it. And he was saying that people think, that they, with improv, they don't think fast enough, and so they can't do it. And when he mentioned that to the interviewer, he then says, no, like 20 times. He says it's not like that. What you need to do is like be clear on the rules so that you don't have to think at some superhuman speed. And so when he described the substitute teacher sketch, for people who haven't seen it, he plays an inner city substitute teacher in this sort of all white suburban classroom. And the gag is that as he's taking attendance, he'll read the names of students and mispronounce them, and they'll try to correct him, and he'll think that they're antagonizing him.
Yeah.
Timothy or whatever. And so he's like, Timothy, he's like, don't get fresh with me, stuff like that. And it's hilarious. And he said this was like basketball, where the writer drew these lines for me. Because, like in basketball, it's like you take a floor and you put some lines on it, and suddenly it has all this meaning, and people know what to do, and they improvise inside of that very contained system. And so he likened it to that, where they had that central premise of, the teacher's going to act like the kids are trying to antagonize him. And he said, then within that, I just go and play basketball. Yeah. And I thought that was just such a cool, and again, as someone who resonates with sports analogies, interesting way to put it. And the fact that he pushed back on this idea of having to think fast enough and was like, no, it's the structure that makes this possible, not the speed of the thought. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting debunking, because when you see improv, right, when you see it happen, I think the instinct is like, holy crap, those people just think a lot faster than I can. Yeah. And so it was really interesting to me, as an outsider, to see him explain it this way. It's like, that's not it at all. It's the structure that empowers us.
Yeah, they're like magicians. So it feels like, oh my God, and it's like, oh, there's so much going on to get them to be able to do the trick. And it's interesting. Keegan came So he starred in our Detroit theater, and he was so great. We're like, please come to Chicago. And we were scheduled to open a show um, on 9/12. And that show on our main stage was, oh God, what was the? I remember the subtitle was like "Fetus Don't Fail Me Now." Oh, it was called "Embryos on Ice." Embryos on Ice or "Fetus Don't Fail Me Now." And then 9/11 happens. We're like, okay, I think we shut down for 2 nights maybe, and then we got back in the rehearsal room. We took out any reference to a plane. We killed the scene. Bad choice of words. That was a person dancing with a cadaver. We just had to make all these sort of and we opened the show, and people were very generous to us, but it didn't work. Keegan was part of the Second City ETC cast. We have the 2 theaters, and that was their 9/11 was their first day of rehearsal. So they just cleaned the dressing room. And then they ran the old show, which mostly kind of worked as they started writing the new show. But every week that progressed, they had a little more insight, a little more freedom in which they could potentially write a satiric show about what was going on in the world. The Onion was there first for anyone who does like as often as they can be, because it was just a headline.
Yeah.
We had to create a 2-act review. But the review that ended up happening, which was called Holy War Batman, it had a theme, and the theme was that Keegan was a cab driver on the night of 9/11, hiding the fact that he was from Afghanistan. And he was picking up various people in the cab, and they'd be like, "Hey, where are you from?" And he's like, "Canada." And it'd be like, "Yeah, but where are you from?" And the he's playing Lee Greenwood. The cab is festooned with American flags, and it really sort of leads to this understanding of all these different people coming in, everyone affected by this thing in a different way, and that it's okay that he is who he is, because he is just a human, and we're all confused by this thing. And I remember right after it got really good reviews, right after opening night, and a group of New York firefighters who had been working at Ground Zero were gifted a trip to Chicago for the weekend, and they came to the show, and so there's like 30 of them, and we like took digs at New York, like we were able by the second act to kind of get a little dirty, a little bit like controversial, and the show got a standing ovation, including them, and Keegan was the one who came out and was like, "I know you just gave us a standing ovation, but we have 30 firefighters working Ground Zero," and everyone rose for them.
Amazing.
And it was one of those nights, right, where I was just I was there because I knew these guys were coming, and I just got to sort of sit against this wall and realize, wow, this is like, but it was the scripted work that allowed for the improvised moment to live in sort of harmony. So I guess this podcast is, yes, promoting your book and also helping me perhaps write my next one.
By the way, I think I saw Holy War Batman.
Yeah.
I think I did.
So the scene that you would remember was Keegan and TJ Jagodowski, who is one of the Sonic guys in the car, doing a scene about like fall. And there's like, oh, fall's so beautiful. And it was like just mind-numbingly good. I mean, that was a incredible show.
I totally saw this. I was in Manhattan I was a few miles away on 9/11 too. And so, but we used to go when I would go home and visit my family, we would go to Second City. So
you're very lucky to have seen that. All right, man, I could talk to you forever. We always end the podcast with a yes and story. I think you have many to choose from.
Yeah. When I said yes to something a little crazy. So I was training to be a scientist in my past life. And when I transitioned out and I decided I wanted to get into writing, couldn't get a job because I didn't have any real experience. And then I applied for one at a tabloid in New York City, and they said no. And then they came back to me and said, if you're willing to be the only person working starting at midnight, like the only member of staff who's on other than the photographers, you can come do it. And I did that. So I became the overnight crime reporter at a tabloid, going from science grad school, pretty jarring transition. And nothing happy that's going in the New York Daily News happens between midnight and 10 a.m., I can assure you. But man, was that an education in how a city works, how to find people who aren't in the phone book, all these sorts of things. And so in a million years, this has never the job that I would have aimed for, right? But I did it. It was incredible education. And then when I finally got to Sports Illustrated later as a temp fact checker, years behind people I was doing like menial work for, it turned out that my crime reporting experience was the thing that made me, and my science background, that made me really unique there. And so I kind of shot up from temp to the youngest senior writer. So I just credit this crazy job, the willingness to take that crazy job, because I knew there was a lot to learn and see where it went. Like, just really propelled a lot of things in my career, even though it seemed like a bizarre move.
Does that room still exist, or are those people working from other places?
The like the newsroom, so they're not in there anymore. So I don't totally know, because the staff is so much smaller. Like the New York Daily News was like one giant room, which I was alone in at night listening to police scanners. But when everyone was in there, it was amazing. If there was a news event, there were TVs mounted on pillars, and everyone would crowd around them. I don't know if they have anything like that anymore. I mean, it's a tiny fraction of what it was when I worked there. Tiny, tiny, tiny. It's like a pamphlet compared to when I worked there.
I say this. So my dad was on WGN radio for 33 years. Roy Leonard. The Tribune Tower, I was constantly going there, and then we had offices there briefly. And I miss that, the buzz and the hum and the activity. And I think the product was better in terms of that sort of shared space, and that we've just lost something without that shared space, because most of the reporters that I know from the Tribune are working from home.
100% agree. I mean, when I think about my time at SI, again, starting as a temp fact checker, I don't know how I could have gotten that education. I was surrounded all day by people better than me at the thing that I wanted to get better at.
Right.
And I just don't know how I would ever recreate that education from just talking to them, listening to them, bouncing ideas off of them. There was this Northwestern research that showed that most of the benefits to mentorship are implicit knowledge, not the things that the mentor tells you, but just like seeing how they behave.
Sure.
And so I really worry about that, especially for younger people when they're so remote, but kind of for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, I remember going into the Billy Goat and being able to sit with Mike Royko. And it's just like this legendary columnist who cranky as all hell, but just like sensing the aura around that and being like, okay, this is important for some reason, and I'm sure I will be able to figure out in my life later.
Yeah, I mean, what was I met Jimmy Breslin, the famous columnist, who's a famous column about the guy digging Kennedy's grave, and a few of us young reporters kind of huddled around him and asked questions, and he said, the problem now is like, you guys are all in good shape because you go to the gym after work. Like, we went all to the bar after work and learned about the craft. And I thought that was, hopefully there's some medium there, but I think there's something real to that.
There's a funny experience that ties into that from our world, which was Mark Maron was doing a book release event at Second City, and I'd never met him. And so he came a little early, and I was like, do you want a tour of the place? He goes, oh, I'd love that. And because the alumni photos at that point were sequential by year, we're going by some of the photos. He's like, died for his art, died for his art, died for his art. And then we get to like the 90s, and he's like, well-adjusted for his art, well-adjusted for his art. Well, and he had this, and he talked about it later on stage. He's like, I just had this experience where I'm like, we all thought we needed to die for our art. And all these people, Colbert, Carell, Tina, like my generation, like they didn't, and they're producing incredible work. And he's like, this is mind-blowing to me.
That's so there is a good medium. Like, you don't have to wreck your body, but you do need some interaction with your colleagues, I think.
That's exactly it. The book is called Inside the Box: How Constraints Make Us Better. Please buy this book. David Epstein, thank you for coming on the pod.
It's a total pleasure and honor.